Imagine standing in front of a mirror, applying a beauty product that makes your eyes appear larger, darker, more captivating. You feel beautiful. You feel seen. You feel powerful. Now imagine that same product is slowly stealing your vision. And you know it, but you use it anyway. This isn't a cautionary tale. This is history. In Renaissance Italy, during the height of aristocratic power and artistic glory, women faced an impossible choice. Large, luminous, dark eyes were not simply admired. They were required. They determined marriage prospects, social standing, survival itself. But nature did not give everyone what society demanded. And so, women turned to a solution that promised beauty and delivered blindness. The name of this miracle substance? Belladonna, beautiful woman. Picture a candlelit salon in Florence, 1520. Silk dresses, painted ceilings, musicians playing softly in corners draped with velvet. In the center of it all, young women, daughters of merchants, nobles, bankers, standing under scrutiny more intense than any modern spotlight. Their faces were studied, compared, judged, not for personality, not for intellect, but for a single measurable quality, beauty. And within beauty, one feature mattered above all others: the eyes. In Renaissance art, you see it everywhere. Botticelli's Venus, Leonardo's Madonnas, eyes painted impossibly large, pupils wide and dark, gazes that seem to pull you inward. These were not artistic exaggerations. They were reflections of what society worshipped. The eye became the soul's window, virtue's proof, desire's invitation. To possess such eyes was to possess power. To lack them was to risk irrelevance. But this was not about vanity. It was about survival in a world where women had almost no control over their futures. Marriage was an economic transaction, a political alliance, a family strategy. Women were the commodities. Their beauty was the price tag. If your eyes were small, dull, or unremarkable, your options narrowed. Your value decreased. Your family's disappointment became your burden. In letters from the period, mothers instructed daughters on appearance with the same urgency they would discuss food or shelter, because appearance was survival. And so, women sought solutions: powders to lighten skin, oils to soften hair, dyes to redden lips. These were not luxuries. They were tools. And among these tools, one promised the most dramatic transformation. The apothecaries knew it well. Physicians had used it for centuries. A plant with dark berries and a darker reputation. Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, toxic in large doses, medicinal in small ones, dangerous always. But someone at some point noticed something peculiar. When belladonna extract touched the eyes, the pupils dilated, widened, darkened, and the effect was beautiful. Eyes appeared larger, more youthful, more expressive. Faces softened. Men lingered. Attention followed. The word spread quietly, the way dangerous knowledge always does. A few drops, a subtle change, a transformation that felt like magic. Women began requesting it from herbalists. Apothecaries prepared it discreetly. Physicians, aware of its risks, said little. After all, it was not their eyes at stake. At first, the consequences seemed minor: mild irritation, temporary blurriness, nothing that beauty had not demanded before. Corsets crushed ribs, lead paint whitened faces, and poisoned blood. Pain was expected. Suffering was proof of dedication. But belladonna was different, because what it took, it did not give back. And by the time women realized cost, it was already too late. So, how did a known poison become a beauty standard? And why did women continue using it even as their vision began to fail? The answer lies in how little society cared about women's health, and how much it cared about women's appearance. Please subscribe to this channel, and comment where you are watching from. To understand how belladonna became a beauty tool, you must first understand what it was, and what it had always been: a weapon disguised as medicine. Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade. The name itself carries warnings in multiple languages. Atropa, after Atropos, the Greek fate who cuts the thread of life. Belladonna, beautiful woman, a name that hints at vanity but hides violence. Even its common name, deadly nightshade, sounds like something from a fairy tale. But this was no fiction. The plant grows wild across Europe. Dark green leaves, bell-shaped purple flowers, and berries small and black that glisten like polished stones. To the untrained eye, they look almost edible, tempting even, but a handful of those berries could kill a grown man. Children died from eating just 2 or 3. For centuries, belladonna was known, feared, and used. Ancient physicians understood its power. Roman doctors applied it as a painkiller. Medieval herbalists used it to dull the agony of surgery. Back when surgery meant holding a patient down while a barber sawed through bone. It could relax muscles, slow the heart, induce sleep, or in the wrong dose, induce death. The line between medicine and poison was razor thin. And no one knew exactly where that line was. Because, in the pre-modern world, medicine was not science. It was tradition, guesswork, observation without understanding. Physicians prescribed belladonna because their teachers had prescribed it, because ancient texts recommended it, because it worked, sometimes in ways no one could fully explain. There were no clinical trials, no dosage standards, no warnings printed on bottles. A physician might tell you to take 3 drops. An apothecary might prepare it differently. Another might use a stronger extract. The plant itself varied in potency, depending on soil, season, and preparation. What worked once might kill the next time. But the truly dangerous part was not the uncertainty. It was the trust. Physicians were authorities. Apothecaries were craftsmen. If they said a substance was safe, people believed them. If they said the benefits outweighed the risks, society accepted it, even when the risks were blindness. So when someone discovered that belladonna could dilate the pupils, it was not seen as a side effect. It was seen as a gift. The mechanism was simple, though no one at the time understood why it worked. Belladonna contains atropine, a compound that blocks certain signals in the nervous system. When applied to the eyes, it paralyzes the muscles that control the pupil. The pupil cannot constrict. It remains wide open, fixed, darkened, and in candlelight, in dim salons and shadowed alcoves, the effect was striking. Eyes appeared larger, more luminous. The darkness of the dilated pupil made the iris seem richer, deeper, more expressive. It was as if the eyes had been painted by an artist's hand. Women noticed the effect. Men noticed the effect. And soon, what had been a medical side effect became a cosmetic goal. The transition was quiet. No grand announcements. No public endorsements. Just whispers between women. Requests made to apothecaries in hushed tones. Small vials exchanged discreetly. A beauty secret that spread the way all dangerous secrets spread, through desire and desperation. At first, it seemed harmless. The dilation was temporary. The effect faded after a few hours. Women applied it before social events, before dances, before being introduced to potential suitors. It gave them confidence. It gave them attention. And in a world where attention determined everything, that was worth the mild discomfort, because there was discomfort, sensitivity to light, a slight burning sensation, blurred vision that made reading difficult, made navigating dim hallways treacherous. But these were small prices, manageable prices. Women had endured far worse in the name of beauty. Corsets restricted breathing and crushed internal organs, but women wore them daily. Lead-based face powder was known to cause illness, but women applied it anyway. Arsenic wafers were eaten to achieve pale, translucent skin, despite the nausea and weakness they caused. Pain was not a deterrent. Pain was proof of commitment. And so, belladonna was added to the arsenal. Just another tool. Just another sacrifice. A few drops in the eyes, a brief moment of stinging, and then beauty. What could possibly go wrong? The problem was that no one was watching what happened over time. No one was tracking the women who used it daily. Weekly, monthly, for years. No one was asking the question that should have been asked from the beginning. What happens when you poison your eyes over and over for the sake of beauty? The answer was coming, but it would take years to fully reveal itself. And by then, the damage would already be done. At first, no one connected the dots. A noble woman in Venice complains of headaches, blurred vision that lingers longer than it should. Her physician prescribes rest, perhaps a tonic. He does not ask about her beauty routine. She does not volunteer the information. A merchant's daughter in Florence struggles to read by candlelight. Her eyes water constantly. Light hurts, but she is young and beauty is expected, so she says nothing. Her mother notices but assumes it is fatigue, weakness, the frailty all women are said to possess. In Rome, a courtesan begins avoiding bright rooms. She claims preference for ambience, for mystery. In truth, sunlight has become unbearable. Her pupils no longer respond the way they should. They remain wide, frozen, unable to protect her eyes from the assault of daylight. These women do not know each other. They live in different cities, move in different circles, but they share something, a secret they guard carefully, a vial hidden in a drawer, a few drops applied before every social engagement, every introduction, every moment that matters. And slowly, quietly, those drops are stealing their sight. The damage does not announce itself. There is no sudden blindness, no dramatic moment of realization. Instead, it creeps in. Vision that was once sharp becomes soft around the edges. Colors lose their vibrancy. Faces blur at a distance. Reading becomes difficult, then painful, then impossible. But the worst part is the light. Healthy pupils constrict in brightness, protecting the delicate structures inside the eye. But Belladonna paralyzes that reflex. The pupil stays wide open, flooding the eye with light it cannot handle. Imagine staring directly at a candle flame and being unable to look away. That is what daylight becomes. A constant, searing brightness that burns. Women who once moved freely through sun-drenched courtyards now cling to shadows. They claim sensitivity, delicate constitutions, a preference for the romantic dimness of evening. But in private they suffer, eyes red and swollen, tears that stream without reason, a throbbing pain that no amount of rest can ease. And still, many continue using Belladonna, because stopping means watching your eyes return to their natural size, watching the beauty fade, watching the attention drift to other women, women with larger, darker, more captivating eyes, women who are still willing to pay the price. In a world where beauty determined survival, the fear of losing it was stronger than the fear of going blind. Some women tried to moderate their use. A few drops instead of many, once a week instead of daily. But the social calendar did not accommodate caution. There were dinners, dances, introductions, opportunities that could not be missed. And at each event, women arrived with eyes wide and dark, competing silently for the same limited resource. Male attention, marriage proposals, security. So the cycle continued. Use, damage, fear, use again. Physicians began to notice patterns, though slowly. Women presenting with chronic eye pain, vision loss that could not be explained by age or injury, light sensitivity, so severe it bordered on debilitating. And when questioned carefully, discreetly, some admitted to using Belladonna. But even then, the response was not alarm. It was dismissal. Women's complaints were often minimized. Hysteria, physicians said, nervousness, an overactive imagination. The female constitution was believed to be inherently weaker, prone to exaggeration and emotional distress. If a woman said her eyes hurt, perhaps she was simply being dramatic. If she struggled to see, perhaps she was not trying hard enough. And so the warnings, when they came, were muted. Quiet suggestions in medical texts, advice given privately to wealthy families, a whispered caution from an apothecary who had seen too many women return with worsening symptoms, but no public outcry, no official condemnation, because condemning Belladonna meant condemning beauty itself. And society was not ready to do that. There were women who stopped in time, who noticed the damage early and walked away, accepting smaller eyes and reduced attention as the cost of keeping their sight. But their stories are not the ones that were told. Success in that world was measured in marriages made, alliances secured, beauty maintained. A woman who chose her health over her appearance was quietly forgotten. The women who continued, however, became cautionary tales whispered in private, the duchess who could no longer recognize faces across a room, the merchant's wife who stumbled in her own home, unable to navigate familiar hallways, the courtesan whose career ended not from age but from eyes so damaged she could no longer meet a client's gaze. These were not rare cases. They were patterns, and the patterns were impossible to ignore. Medical writings from the late Renaissance and early modern period contain references to the dangers of belladonna in cosmetic use. One Italian physician warned that repeated application would lead to permanent damage to the eyes, describing patients who had lost significant vision. Another noted that the practice was more common than people admitted, and far more dangerous than women believed. But these warnings existed in academic texts written in Latin, read by other physicians. They did not reach the women who needed them most, and even if they had, it is unclear how many would have listened, because by then, belladonna was not just a beauty tool. It was an expectation, a standard, a silent requirement for women who want to compete in a world that valued their appearance above everything else. The tragedy was not that women used belladonna. The tragedy was that they felt they had no choice. And so the practice continued, even as the evidence mounted, even as more women lost their sight, even as the cost became undeniable. Beauty, it seemed, was worth any price, even blindness. The evidence was undeniable, yet denial persisted. By the mid to late Renaissance, physicians across Europe had documented enough cases to establish a clear pattern. Women using belladonna cosmetically were losing their vision. The connection was not speculative. It was observable, repeatable, and increasingly common. Medical texts began including explicit warnings. Some apothecaries refused to prepare the extract for cosmetic purposes. A few prominent physicians spoke out publicly, calling the practice dangerous and irresponsible. But resistance came from every direction. Apothecaries who profited from belladonna sales defended it. They claimed the problem was not the substance, but the misuse. Women were using too much, they said, applying it incorrectly, purchasing inferior preparations from unscrupulous sources. If only they followed proper guidelines, if only they exercised moderation, belladonna would be perfectly safe. This argument was appealing because it placed the blame squarely on the user. It was not the poison that was dangerous. It was the poison who were careless. Wealthy families, whose daughters had used belladonna for years, resisted the warnings as well. To admit the danger was to admit complicity. To acknowledge that they had encouraged, enabled, or even demanded that their daughters use a substance that was now stealing their sight. Some families quietly stopped the practice, but refused to speak of it. Others doubled down, insisting their daughters had suffered no ill effects, even as those daughters squinted in sunlight and struggled to read. And then there were the women themselves. For some, stopping was unthinkable. They had built their identities, their marriages, their social positions on the foundation of their beauty. To admit that beauty had come at the cost of their health was to admit they had made a terrible mistake. And admitting that mistake meant confronting a question too painful to answer. Was it worth it? So they continued, quietly, desperately, telling themselves the warnings were exaggerated, that their case was different, that they could stop any time they wanted. They just did not want to. Not yet. Others tried to find alternatives, safer methods, different preparations. Some apothecaries experimented with diluted extracts, claiming they had perfected a version that offered the cosmetic effect without the risk. Women tried these new formulas, hoping for beauty without consequence. But belladonna is belladonna. Dilution only delayed the damage. It did not prevent it. There were also economic incentives to keep the practice alive. Apothecaries relied on the income. Herbalists who supplied the raw plant material depended on the demand. Even some physicians, despite their warnings, continued prescribing it for medical use, which created a gray area. If belladonna was acceptable for medicine, why not for beauty? Where exactly was the line? That question was never satisfactorily answered. But slowly, the practice began to fade, not because of moral outrage or medical intervention, but because of something far more powerful. Fashion change. Beauty ideals are not fixed. They shift with culture, with art, with the whims of influential figures. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the hyperfeminine, doe-eyed aesthetic of the Renaissance began to give way to other trends. Pale skin remained important. Red lips stayed fashionable. But the obsession with unnaturally large eyes began to diminish. New beauty standards emerged. The severity of Spanish fashion influenced European courts. Restraint became elegant. Excess became gauche. And with that shift, the demand for belladonna declined. It was not a sudden disappearance. Women did not wake up one day and collectively abandon the practice. Instead, it faded gradually. Older generations continued using it out of habit. Younger women, seeing the damage in their mothers and aunts, chose not to start. Apothecaries stopped advertising it. Physicians stopped defending it. And within a generation or two, the practice that had once been so common, it was unremarkable, became a relic, a strange, dangerous habit from a previous era. But the women who had suffered did not recover. Vision loss caused by belladonna is permanent. The damage to the eye's structure, to the nerves, to the mechanisms that control light sensitivity, cannot be reversed. Women who had used it for years were left with chronic pain, extreme light sensitivity, and vision so impaired they could no longer function independently. Some went completely blind. Others retained partial sight, but lived in constant discomfort. Many became reclusive, unable to tolerate the brightness of day, confined to dark rooms, and dependent on others for basic tasks. And society moved on. There were no apologies, no compensations, no acknowledgement of the systemic pressure that had driven women to poison themselves in the first place. The women who suffered were quietly forgotten. Their stories, if told at all, were framed as cautionary tales about vanity, about foolishness, about the dangers of excess. But that framing was a lie. These women were not vain. They were not foolish. They were trapped in a system that valued their appearance above their health, their autonomy, their lives. They were told, explicitly and implicitly, that beauty was their currency, that without it, they had no value. And when they sought the tools to meet those impossible standards, they were given poison. The real tragedy of belladonna eyes is not that women used it. The real tragedy is that they had to. Belladonna faded from beauty routines centuries ago, but the mindset that enabled it never disappeared. The story of belladonna eyes is not an isolated incident. It is not a strange aberration from a less enlightened time. It is a pattern that repeats across centuries, across cultures, across every society that has ever placed a burden of beauty on women's bodies. Throughout history, beauty has demanded sacrifice, and women have paid. In ancient Rome, women used lead-based cosmetics to achieve pale, flawless skin. The lead poisoned them slowly, causing neurological damage, organ failure, and death. But pale skin signaled wealth and status, so they continued. In 18th century Europe, women wore corsets laced so tightly they could barely breathe. Ribs cracked, organs shifted. Fainting was so common it became romanticized. But a tiny waist was fashionable, so they endured. In Victorian England, women consumed arsenic wafers to achieve translucent porcelain skin. The arsenic caused nausea, weakness, and long-term poisoning. But the aesthetic was worth it. In the early 20th century, women used radium-laced beauty products, believing the glow of radioactivity would make their skin luminous. Instead, it caused cancer, tissue death, and agonizing decay. But the promise of beauty justified the risk. And belladonna was no different. Just another substance in a long line of poisons, another tool in the arsenal of beauty, another example of how far women have been expected to go to meet impossible standards. The question is not why did they use it. The question is why did they have to? And the answer is always the same. Because their value was tied to their appearance. Because beauty was not a choice but a requirement. Because refusal meant invisibility, poverty, or social death. Because the system that judged them offered no alternative. Belladonna is gone, but the pressure remains. Today, women undergo surgeries that carry serious risks. Injections that can cause nerve damage, allergic reactions, or disfigurement. Procedures that promise youth, beauty, perfection, but come with pages of warnings and possible complications. And still, millions choose them, not because they are vain, not because they are foolish, but because the pressure to look a certain way has not diminished. It has simply evolved. Social media has created new standards. Filters have made natural faces seem inadequate. Algorithms reward beauty and punish deviation. And women, once again, are modifying their bodies to meet external expectations. The tools are different. The names have changed. But the underlying logic is identical. Beauty is still currency. Appearance is still scrutinized. And women are still being asked to sacrifice their health, their comfort, and their autonomy in pursuit of an ideal that serves everyone but them. The women who used Belladonna were not weak. They were not ignorant. They were navigating a world that gave them no good options. And the same is true today. We look back at Belladonna eyes with horror. We cannot believe women would poison themselves for beauty. But if we are honest, truly honest, we must ask ourselves, what are we doing now that future generations will look back on with the same disbelief? What procedures are we normalizing? What standards are we enforcing? What pain are we dismissing as acceptable because beauty demands it? The legacy of Belladonna is not just a history lesson. It is a mirror. It shows us that beauty standards are not natural. They are constructed, enforced, profited from, and the cost is always borne by those who have the least power to resist. The women who use Belladonna deserve better. They deserved a world that valued them for more than their appearance. They deserved autonomy over their own bodies. They deserved to be told the truth about the risks. They deserve to have real choices. And so do we. Belladonna may be gone, but its lesson remains. Beauty has always asked for sacrifices. The question is whether we will continue to pay. Because the real danger was never just the poison. It was the pressure. It was the silence. It was a belief that beauty was worth more than health, more than safety, more than life itself. And until we confront that belief, the story of Belladonna eyes will never truly be over.